All right, we're starting with the background. Just like almost any paintings that I'll ever do, I always start with the background, acrylic, watercolor, or otherwise, just because it's easier to paint the background and then the tree afterwards than it would be to paint the tree and then paint the background around. That a lot of times, if you're thinking of the positive space first, then you forget and you use a cop-out background, like just a plain gradient. But if you start with the background and you have the most motivation when you start most of the time, then you're more likely to make something interesting. So I just mapped out some blue in a wet on wet fashion. Down here I'm doing a wet on dry, especially as I move forward towards the foreground. I did a cling wrap to show some of the rock textures on the red areas of this hill. Gonna do some more of the shadow areas of these patches of grass in more cool colors, and then I can build on top of them. That a lot of watercolor is a lot of back and forth, so lifting and adding and lifting and adding. Some of it is planning ahead. We're mostly using things that we have at home to do these techniques, but there's another masking technique called a frisket, which is pretty popular. I in the past have taught it using rubber cement because frisket can be really expensive. So we've used rubber cement and it works just as well. You just have to be careful to get it out of your paintbrush if you're going to do that. So that can mask off areas as well as masking tape. That using masking tape can make it so that you can protect areas from getting painted on. Also, one other thing I wanted to mention, traditionally watercolor, once you've stretched, so once you've taped down your paper, that a lot of the time artists will spray their paper first. Sometimes that you even soak your paper and then the paper tape might stick better. But that this is optional, that it will be successful either way. That it is, if you're planning on really, really saturating your watercolor paper, which probably most of us are not, that for doing wet on wet techniques right now, that's something that you can do to preemptively make it so that your paper is less likely to buckle, so get all wavy and have puddles on it. But we're using these dried liquid watercolors. So they're really, really pigmented. They're not at all like the little kid watercolors that you had growing up, but that they are not wet. Pre-wet watercolors can be really, really great, but I don't have a noticeable difference. If anything, I prefer them a little bit dry. That way you can get a smaller amount on your brush if you wanted to. That you don't have to wait necessarily and water it down more. So I'm just building up some of these areas, and some of this I might end up taking off too. So you be careful not to get too wet close to the tape, because then it might peel, but you'll notice that it's hard enough to get it off, that it should be okay unless you get it super, super wet. So I'm just adding colors together that kind of overall will read as green. So I'm putting a little bit of red, a little bit of blue, a little bit of yellow in there to make just the right amount of green and also have interesting colors, because you know the most contrast and the largest shapes to show space and depth, that those things are all close to you in the foreground. So detail, space and depth, contrast, that those things do not exist in the background. So I used a wet on wet technique to show the hills and kind of mountains in the very back so that they are blurry. That wet on wet technique is very good at that. I also did some tissue lift in the clouds. I really, like I said earlier, I really used every single one of the 7 techniques. That I used some of the dry brushing techniques on the rocks. I used wet on wet for clouds, as well as the mountain hills in the background. I used wet on dry for these areas that I'm painting right now. You'd be surprised how quickly your watercolor paints dry. That to do wet on dry does not take very much. That they dry very quickly. Here I am toning down my sky, that it's not near as blue as it originally, or the blue from the tube that is in your kits. So I wanted to tone mine down a little bit, and so I'm trying to wet the whole thing and strategically adding some of these colors that are the opposite blue. So a little bit of that yellow ochre and a little bit of the cadmium red that is in your little kit palettes is what I was using to tone down the clouds and to add shadows where there's shadows. I could have added some more shadows on that right side, but I didn't really want it to distract too much from the piece. So here's the finished piece. You can watch the other video to take off your gum tape. Let me know if you have questions. Thank